Hello everyone, my name is Robius, and today I'm happy to bring you the 16th episode in the renewed iteration of Assassin's Creed: The Real History. Following the pattern laid out in the previous weeks, this video will be part of my ongoing sub-series in which I chronologically explore the time periods chosen as the backdrops for the various Assassin's Creed titles, reviewing their major historical events, discussing any gaps in the history left by the games, and introducing you to the individuals who actually existed. Ergo, today's episode will concentrate on the French and Indian War, the period which predominantly served as the backdrop for Assassin's Creed Rogue, but which was also briefly visited in Assassin's Creed 3 and to a marginal extent, Assassin's Creed Liberation. Consequently, please be aware of related story spoilers throughout the entire video. As a starting point, when considering the years that preceded the Assassin's Creed games, I'd like to commence this episode by establishing my intended scope for this topic. It is important to understand that the French and Indian War was actually a specification which represented the North American theater of the much larger and more widespread 7 Years' War. Although technically speaking, the official declarations of war and later signing of the peace treaties have the conflict stretching from 1756 to 1763, we'll actually be starting this video a few years earlier with the purpose of covering the circumstances leading up to these hostilities. Lastly, it's worth mentioning that the name the French and Indian War is predominantly used by the British and Americans, who named the conflict as such since it noted their adversaries during that struggle, whereas in most other countries, this fighting is traditionally just grouped together with the rest of the 7 Years' War. Having said that, let's now explore the circumstances that led to the opening of the French and Indian War. Although it was fundamentally the product of culminating tensions between the British and the French North American colonies, a few key elements lay the groundwork for the opening of this larger-scale conflict. At their core, most of these events were tied into a dispute over the technical ownership of the Ohio country. This debate became more serious following increased attempts by the British in 1747 to broaden their trading network into the Ohio country, an area to which the French laid claim. After these efforts became more brazen, the French responded by launching a 6-month military expedition in 1749, in which their troops expulsed British traders from the region and sought to solidify their own tribal relations. Despite this aggravation, the British sponsored the efforts of the Ohio Company of Virginia, who in turn hired the frontiersman Christopher Gist in 1750 to explore the Ohio region and establish new treaties with local tribes to allow further colonial expansion. By 1752, the French again responded with another military expedition that began eliminating illegal trading posts, arresting British traders, and attacking opposing native tribes. Technically speaking, although exact dates are not provided, this was around the point where Assassin's Creed Rogue officially began, with the fictional then-assassin Shay Cormac operating in the North Atlantic in 1752. As part of the fabricated plot in Assassin's Creed, under the guise of having the assassins hunting down high-ranking Templar figures, the game has Shay briefly eavesdrop on a meeting between these individuals, who included Lawrence Washington, Samuel Smith, and James Wardrop. Interestingly enough, although they evidently were not members of the secret Templar Order, these three men were in fact involved as either founding members or as shareholders within the Ohio Company of Virginia. Nonetheless, as part of the invented narrative, Shay proceeded to assassinate the tuberculosis-ridden Lawrence Washington, and then began his hunt for the other two Templars in hopes of recovering the precursor artifacts they had stolen from the assassins. Historically, during this period of downtime in the game, the aforementioned military conflict was intensified further as the French launched yet another expedition into the Ohio Valley in 1753. Looking to make a more definitive claim to the region, they began constructing forts at various key locations while ousting opposing tribes from the area. This led certain Iroquois representatives to seek aid from their British allies, which they did by visiting William Johnson, the former superintendent for Indian Affairs. Having resigned from his role, Johnson was unable to pressure the governor of New York into supporting their allies by pushing back against the French, which ultimately led the Iroquois Confederacy to declare their relationship with the British over. Soon after this debacle, the governor of Virginia stepped in to make a show of force against the French. To that effect, in late 1753, he dispatched a small expedition under the command of the young George Washington. This expedition set off with the goal of meeting the French to demand they leave the region. The French commander flatly refused these demands, expressing that the area belonged to them as the French had been its original explorers. Washington returned to the governor in early 1754 with this message, learning upon his arrival that plans had already been made to build a British fort in the area to counter the expected French advance. Unfortunately for the British, additional French troops were dispatched and marched to the construction site of this new fort, permitting the British to leave while paying them for their equipment, which the French then used to complete Fort Duquesne for themselves. Within Assassin's Creed 3's lore, this would be the approximate period in which Haytham Kenway killed one of the British assassin mentors and then began his journey to the 13 colonies in hopes of consolidating its Templar presence. Contextually, this was also around the point where Shay finally tracked down Samuel Smith and killed him, thus recovering the precursor box in the name of the assassins. However, historically speaking, this earlier development with the French taking the fort coincided with the Virginian governor dispatching Washington to support what he thought was the continued construction of a British fort. On his way, Washington met the retreating British forces and consequently devised a plan to oust the French. Grouping together with native allies, Washington mustered his troops and ambushed a French scouting party in May of 1754, killing their commander and routing their forces in the Battle of Jumonville Glen. This very confrontation is commonly recognized as the unofficial start of the French and Indian War. Thereafter, Washington's forces retreated and built Fort Necessity in an attempt to solidify their regional control. However, within around a month, the French struck back, forcing Washington to surrender. Overall, it was these two battles that signaled the opening of larger-scale hostilities within the colonies. Although the majority of the large-scale battles to come would occur in the more northern colonies, there were intermittent conflicts in the southern colonies as well, with certain individuals being recognized for their participation in this less active theater. One of these men was Gilbert Antoine de Saint-Maxent, who played a role in defending French Louisiana from joint British and native attacks. Following these confrontations, delegates from 7 of the 13 colonies gathered together in what came to be known as the Albany Congress, which occurred from mid-June to mid-July of 1754. This event was represented in Assassin's Creed Rogue as Shay continued his hunt for the Templar James Wardrop. While present at the gathering, Shay overheard a speech delivered by Benjamin Franklin, who was making a strong effort to convince the delegates to accept his plan of union. Historically, this was Franklin's unsuccessful attempted push, with the slogan "Join or Die," to unite the colonies under the authority of a monarchy-approved executive who could manage their military defense and legislations. Overall, this plan did not work out, as the Congress was primarily concerned with attempting to negotiate better treaties with their potential indigenous allies. Nonetheless, following the Congress, the game has Shay conclude his fictional hunt for Wardrop, finally killing the Templar and recovering the Voynich manuscript, which was the remaining precursor artifact the assassins had lost. This was immediately followed up with another invented interaction in which Benjamin Franklin worked with the assassins to decode the message of the precursor artifacts, eventually discovering Lisbon to be the location of a first civilization temple for which they had been searching. This would later lead Shay to begin his voyage to Portugal in hopes of reaching the site. Within the real history, in response to the earlier battles, the British government resolved to organize an army expeditionary force under the command of Major General Edward Braddock with the purpose of putting an end to the French aggression. Having learned of these plans, the French mustered their own army, commanded by the Baron d'Iscot, who they sent off to the colonies despite British attempts to intercept their vessels. In Assassin's Creed 3's storyline, this was around the general time frame in which Haytham Kenway reached Boston and was greeted by his ally Charles Lee, an officer in the British Army serving in the colonies at that time. Working in unison with Charles, Haytham would then proceed to gather his other local Templar allies, among which were the Marine Lieutenant John Pitcairn, the soldier Thomas Hickey, and the physician Benjamin Church. Although some records are contradictory on when Pitcairn and Hickey reached the colonies, certain sources claim that all of these individuals would have historically been present in that general area at that time. What followed was a fictional series of missions in which the Templars consolidated their regional control and began their hunt for a first civilization storehouse. Anyways, getting back to the real history. Following Braddock's arrival in the colonies, the British prepared to launch their first large-scale response to the prior French advances. Braddock's expedition against Fort Duquesne was to be one of 4 separate assaults in which the British sought to capture 4 different French forts. Leading a mixed force of British regulars and colonial militia, supported by George Washington, this army began its march in June of 1755. By July 8th, they were near their target and were approached by French and native envoys who offered to negotiate for their peaceful withdrawal from the fort. General Braddock refused these terms, as was briefly mentioned in Assassin's Creed 3. On the following day, despite Washington's warnings to Braddock that his advance was vulnerable due to the differences between the European warfare to which he was accustomed and the more guerrilla-based approach used by native and colonial forces, the general still pushed forward. As they crossed the river, the British forces suddenly ran into the French and their native allies, who were on their way too, but had not yet set up their ambush. What followed is remembered as the Battle of the Monongahela, which was paralleled in Assassin's Creed 3. Historically, within the opening volleys of the confrontation, the French officer Daniel Lignal de Beaujeu was killed. However, this didn't prevent the Franco-native coalition from quickly gaining the upper hand and defeating the British expedition in a battle that ultimately led to the later death of Braddock from his injuries. Although much of this conflict was covered in AC3, a few main differences depicted were the fact that the entire ambush was organized by Haytham and his native allies, along with the idea that Charles Lee was the one to kill Beaujeu. In reality, aside from Braddock's failure, the second British expedition was brought to a halt due to disorganization. The third ended without any change in territorial gains following the Battle of Lake George, while the fourth concluded with the successful acquisition of Fort Beauséjour, thus isolating the fortress of Louisbourg from any further French ground support. As part of a long-term campaign effort to continue cutting off Louisbourg from French allies and trade, the British began the expulsion of the Acadians, a task in which they sought to forcibly remove and relocate the native Acadian population from their homes. Many of these individuals would eventually be moved to southern colonies. Evidently, this effort was met with fierce resistance over the following years. Anecdotally, although not related to the French and Indian War, this would have been the point in Rogue where Shea reached Lisbon and the game had him accidentally cause the November 1st, 1755 earthquake that essentially destroyed the city by disturbing the piece of Eden hidden below it. The assassin would barely escape this disaster, sail back home, and then accuse his mentor of setting him up to slaughter innocents. Ultimately, in this fictional confrontation, Shea would try to steal the precursor manuscript to prevent this event from ever being repeated. However, he would eventually be caught by the assassins, and when trying to escape, would be shot and fall off a cliff. This would then lead to the equally invented plot section, in which Shea would be saved by an unknown figure and brought to New York to recover, from where he would then launch his personal campaign against the local gangs. Historically, by 1756, the British war effort was disorganized as their new leadership structure, established after Braddock's death, was incapable of creating an agreed-upon set of expeditions. Taking advantage of this disarray, the Governor-General of New France launched an aggressive retaliation, leading to the destruction of a British fort at the Battle of Fort Bull. Consequently, both France and Britain sought to install new leadership structures for their forces within the colonies, with the French reinforcements under Louis-Joseph de Montcalm and the Chevalier de Lévis arriving in May, while the British under Loudon and Abercrombie were established in July. As one of his first acts, Montcalm was victorious at the Battle of Fort Oswego, and thus further limited the British capabilities to launch attacks into New France. It is also worth mentioning that in May of 1756, war was officially declared between Britain and France, thus signifying the technical start of the 7 Years' War. Although the conflict had already been raging for nearly 2 years, some sources record that this official declaration pushed even more individuals to enlist, with Paul Revere being one example, despite not actually seeing any fighting during his brief tenure in the militia. This was the time frame in Rogue where Shea, the fictional protagonist, became more involved in the Templar movement indirectly, helping them fight off the gangs in New York while also defeating certain assassin allies. In reality, at this time, the British sought to strike a major blow to the French by attacking Quebec, their capital. However, before this plan could be executed, it was instead decided that the fortress of Louisbourg should be dealt with beforehand. During this year, there were continued naval confrontations between the British and the French in that area, with an example of this being the failed attempt of the Commissary General Jean-Jacques Blaise d'Abbadie to deliver supplementary resources to their now isolated fortress of Louisbourg. Nonetheless, by the time the British were ready to strike, the French naval presence around Louisbourg had finally increased to a point where success seemed unlikely, leading them to cancel their invasion. Notably, among the chaos surrounding this naval warfare, another incredibly important confrontation was unfolding at Fort William Henry. Following an extended campaign where Montcalm's troops successfully picked off additional British forces, destroyed their supplies, and left them stranded, the French general began his approximate week-long siege in August of 1757. At the time, the fort's outnumbered British garrison was led by Colonel George Monro, who did his best to hold off the French in hopes that reinforcements might arrive. However, he was eventually forced to surrender. This event and its subsequent aftermath were also depicted in Assassin's Creed Rogue. Within the game's narrative, one of Monro's requests for help made it to Shea, who sailed quickly to Fort William Henry in hopes of assisting his ally. Upon arrival, he learned that William Johnson's reinforcements had never arrived, which historically happened since Johnson's superior refused to dispatch the man and his joint native militia force because he felt that the fort was already lost. Nonetheless, Shea reached the outside of the fort just as the British began their withdrawal, which was part of their surrender terms that stipulated they would leave without further confrontation on the condition that the garrison be allowed to travel unharmed to Fort Edward. What followed is considered among the most notorious events of the war. During their evacuation, the British soldiers were suddenly attacked by Montcalm's native allies who disregarded the terms of the surrender. Although sources differ on the number of casualties incurred and the degree to which the French military tried to stop the attack, it is generally listed as a massacre, with many of the British being either killed or taken captive. Within the scope of Assassin's Creed Rogue, the suddenness of this inexplicably violent event is attributed to the fictional native assassin Kisegawase, who the game depicted as organizing the massacre for the purpose of killing Monroe, who was a Templar, and retrieving the precursor manuscript he possessed. However, Shea's intervention allowed Monroe to survive, which paralleled his actual real-world survival of the attack. What then followed in the game months later was an entirely fictional battle in which Kisegawase and his allies struck at Albany in hopes of assassinating Monroe. Although Shea defeated the assassin, Monroe was still killed, and the manuscript was lost, which the game used to explain the former's death from natural causes on November 3, 1757. Immediately after this, Haytham Kenway, the Grand Master of the Colonial Templars, officially inducted Shea into their order. Historically, with the beginning of 1758, the tide of the French and Indian War started to shift. Between the British limiting their capacity to receive supplies from France, a subpar harvest, and an increase in disease, the forces in New France were incapable of renewing their offensive and instead settled into a defensive position in hopes of holding their line. Determined to seize this opportunity and gain access to the St. Lawrence River to launch future attacks into New France, the British prepared another attempt to take Louisbourg. Under the command of Major General Geoffrey Amherst, a large British fleet lay siege to the fortress for nearly 2 months until it finally capitulated. Assassin's Creed Rogue featured part of this siege when Shea and his fellow Templars joined their ally, James Cook, the master of the HMS Pembroke, with the intention of providing their support in his real-world participation within the battle. It was during this fictionally exaggerated portion of the conflict with the French vessels that the Templars faced off with the equally invented assassin Adewale, who was eventually forced to flee when the full might of the British fleet arrived to lay siege to the fortress. They would thereafter proceed to hunt down and kill the assassin for his interference. In reality, the second British invasion planned for that year met with disaster when the significantly larger army led by James Abercrombie was thoroughly defeated by the much smaller French forces under the command of Louis-Joseph de Montcalm during the 2-day Battle of Fort Carillon. Although it is worth mentioning that a detachment of these same British forces did succeed in capturing and then destroying Fort Frontenac nearly 2 months later. Following the mixed results of their second army, the final British invasion force reached Fort Duquesne in September of 1758. Although the French defenders initially succeeded in holding the invaders back, recognizing that they were outnumbered and likely could not withstand another attack, they remained in the fort until November, at which point they burned it to the ground and fled the area. By the end of 1758, in face of its limited colonial victories, France instead decided to invest in a failed plan to invade Britain as part of the more widespread 7 Years' War, which ultimately meant a decline in their commitment to the North American theater of the conflict. Consequently, in 1759, the British were once again on the offensive. The Battle of Fort Niagara occurred throughout the month of July, and concluded with a British victory under the leadership of William Johnson, who took command when his superior was killed in the fighting. Immediately afterwards, General Amherst's army arrived at Fort Carillon and dwarfed the small force of French defenders within. Following orders from Montcalm, the French commander stationed at Carillon attempted to burn the fort down. However, after they fled, the final damage wasn't significant, and the British were able to occupy and fortify the position, renaming it Fort Ticonderoga. Serving as a captain in the provincial army at the time, James Barrett was present during this period of British military success. Many of these prior conflicts, including the earlier capture of Louisbourg, all came into play following a 3-month siege that led to the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in September of 1759. This significant confrontation is said to have taken less than an hour, the results of which were an overwhelming British victory. Notably, both of the opposing armies' commanders, James Wolfe on the British side and Louis-Joseph de Montcalm on the French side, died from wounds incurred during this fighting. Within the following days, the city of Quebec was surrendered to the British. John Parker was among the soldiers who served in this conflict on the British side, acting as a sergeant during the battle. The results of this confrontation are thought to have been among the most deciding instances in determining the victor of this war. Given the start of the winter season, the fighting subsided for the following months. These same months would actually represent the concluding portion of Assassin's Creed Rogue. At this point, the game tackled an entirely fictionalized stretch of the story that first had Shay confront and kill the invented assassin Hope while in New York in October of 1759, and then begin his hunt for Louis-Joseph Gauthier, Chevalier de la Vérendrye, a former commandant of the Poste de l'Ouest that the game presented as a member of the Assassin Brotherhood. The Templars finally caught up to him in early 1760 and learned from Louis-Joseph the location of Liam and Achilles. Ultimately, this led to an invented final confrontation in March of 1760 after sailing to the Arctic, in which the Templars and the Assassins fought, accidentally triggering an earthquake by touching the Piece of Eden. In the end, Liam died from his injuries, and Shay convinced Haytham to spare Achilles, which he did, but only after crippling him. As the final portion of Shay's story within this time frame, he was given the years-long task of tracking down the precursor box that the Templars had lost. Historically, in April of 1760, the Chevalier de Lévis, successor to Montcalm, led his army back to Quebec and faced off against the British defenders under James Murray. After a bloody day of fighting during the Battle of Saint Foy, the British were overwhelmed by the French advance and retreated back into Quebec City. Although the Chevalier de Lévis lay siege to the city, he was unable to take it and waited for reinforcements and supplies from France. Unfortunately, these efforts were thwarted during the Battle of Restigouche, in which the British completely halted any relief efforts heading to the troops in New France. Without any support, and with additional British troops arriving instead, the Chevalier de Lévis was forced to lift his siege and return to Montréal. By September of 1760, with British forces under General Amherst closing in on Montréal, and with no relief in sight, the French negotiated their surrender in a deal which would permit their citizens to maintain their colonial residences and their right to practice their religion, to which the British agreed. It is said that Israel Putnam was one of the many soldiers who marched onto Montréal in this final stage of the North American conflict. Although this technically marked the end of the French and Indian War in 1760, hostilities continued in the form of minor, isolated skirmishes that were often silenced by the British until the February 10, 1763 signing of the Treaty of Paris, which signaled the official end to the conflict in tandem with the end of the 7 Years' War. It would have been within this interval of time, following the surrender of Montréal in late 1760, that the young Radou-na-Kaidoun's village was burned down in November. In the game, this was presented as the doing of George Washington, who ordered his troops to destroy the village in an attempt to halt any further attacks from regional Native American tribes. Although I had trouble finding any historical equivalent to this event, it definitely paralleled Washington's later actions during the American Revolution and was perhaps representative of certain extreme measures used by the British in this immediate post-war period when quelling rebellions that opposed their victory. Nonetheless, for the post-game history, I'll just quickly go over the concluding circumstances of this conflict. In terms of the major results of the war within the North American colonies specifically, France essentially surrendered the vast majority of its regional colonial holdings, with the British acquiring French Canada and Acadia alongside Spanish Florida, while the Spanish were given French Louisiana in turn. Now that we've reached the conclusion of this sizable event, I feel comfortable moving on to the final chapter of the video. In this portion, we'll review everything that's been learned today and compare its depiction in the games to the actual history. To start, I'm just briefly going to go over the entirely fictionalized portions of the game during the French and Indian War. Clearly, chief among these fabrications, as always, is the Assassin versus Templar battle that formulates the protagonists' narratives during their hunt for the precursor artifacts. Next was the attack on Albany, led by the fictional assassin Kisegawase, which never historically occurred. Lastly, and I suppose this does tie into my first point, Assassin's Creed Rogue's ending, from Shay's hunt for Hope all the way to Haytham sparing Achilles and all the confrontations therein, was essentially fictionalized. Having cleared up those entirely imagined segments of the game, we'll now go over the real historical events that Ubisoft either manipulated or embellished as a way of accommodating their Assassin's Creed plot. Although I won't get too into detail about how various individuals weren't actually assassinated but rather died from different causes, as that will be saved for their respective videos at a later date, I will momentarily touch on a few of these cases in this summary. For that reason, the first point I want to touch on was Shays' mission to kill Lawrence Washington. Despite actually dying around that time from tuberculosis, the element I personally liked more about this encounter was how the game presented a connection between Lawrence, Samuel, and James as members of the Templar Order, which paralleled their actual connection as business associates within the Ohio Company of Virginia. The next element I found worth discussing is the presence of Hatham's allies within the colonies. Even though there isn't much question as to Lee, Church, and Johnson being in the region, the game seems to have taken the side of certain sources which state that Hickey and Pitcairn would have also been near Boston at that time, a fact that is contradicted by certain other resources that only claim they reached the colonies later. Admittedly, due to the limited records on both individuals, this isn't necessarily an incorrect point, but rather just one to take with a grain of salt, since there are contradictory interpretations on their arrival dates. In succession to this idea, I'll also quickly reiterate that, notwithstanding the fact that there was an earthquake in Lisbon on November 1st, 1755, it clearly wasn't caused by a piece of Eden. Anyways, the following historical tweak occurred during the surrender of Fort William Henry, when the game took liberties by crediting the native attack on the plans of the assassin Kesegawase who sought to kill George Monroe, when in reality the reason for committing this massacre remains a debated topic to this day. Also, just before I reach my last anecdote, I'd like to quickly mention that the naval battle depicted in the game as a prelude to the siege of Louisbourg was overall an exaggeration, as the French did not launch a preemptive strike which was almost single-handedly dealt with by one vessel. In fact, they were significantly outnumbered by the British, which meant that the French generally maintained a defensive position throughout that conflict. Lastly, the final point worth discussing when considering alterations to the history by the games was George Washington's role in the destruction of Radunakedun's village during the French and Indian War. Whereas there are records of Washington's involvement in such attacks later in his life, I couldn't find a definitive source that stated he committed these acts during the French and Indian War. Although this wasn't an uncommon occurrence during the period, and Washington did come to be known by the Iroquois as the Town Destroyer, although some attribute this more to his familial ties to John Washington, who was given the same name years earlier. Keeping all that information in mind, we can now take a moment and contemplate whether the French and Indian War was fairly depicted mainly between Assassin's Creed Rogue and Assassin's Creed 3. In general, I would personally say that this conflict was well demonstrated in the games, however there are definitely a few aspects I'd like to quickly go over. My main grievance, and again this is a personal opinion, is tied to the fact that despite the choice to essentially have the assassins on the side of the French and the Templars on the side of the British, this only came into play in a couple of instances within the story in terms of the battles and events depicted. Furthermore, and I realize I'm nitpicking here, it was also odd to see Adewale back, but this time supporting the French war effort, especially when taking into consideration the events of Freedom Cry. Nevertheless, outside of these minor complaints, I truly appreciated the attention to detail which was utilized when portraying certain developments in the war. In particular, among those that stuck out for me were the Albany Congress, where we got to see Benjamin Franklin proposing his Plan of the Union, which was seen as too extreme at the time, but would prove to be a foundational concept behind the later Articles of Confederation. Another such occurrence was during the Braddock Expedition, where even with the game's alterations, much of the actual history behind the failed British attack was fairly demonstrated, down to the general's disinclination to resolving things peacefully before the fighting began. Overall, although the game's stories only occasionally intersected with a few of the French and Indian War's major events, when they did so, it was traditionally with an appreciated attention to detail, and for that reason, I did enjoy getting to play through this influential historical period, which would be integral in setting the stage for the later American Revolutionary War. Having said that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you enjoyed the content, please share this series with your friends, and be sure to explore our other episodes. I've just passed the halfway mark on covering the time periods of the franchise's main titles, and although I intend on finishing this process before tackling other subjects, please feel free to leave me your topic requests for future videos in the comments. As always, my sources used for making this video will be in the description bar below. Thank you for watching.